chat real quick so I don't forget. Yeah, that's so exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very busy couple of days here.
Yes, exactly. With the book just coming out, we're glad you can. And then you're headed to France or something next week?
Next week on Monday, I'm going to the Nantucket Book Festival, which starts tomorrow, and I'll be there for a couple of days. And then there is a book festival in Beacon, New York, where I'm speaking with Will Shorts, which will be really fun.
Oh, yeah.
And then I'm off to France for my French book tour because they decided to publish at the same time. So
You're
a
like,
whirlwind.
thanks a bunch.
Thank you. No, it's actually great to get it all done, I think, in one tour, because otherwise it really disrupts the writing process. When I'm done with this, I'm going to go back home and I'm going to furiously try to get a draft of the next book done.
Well, and while we're kind of letting people still hop on, you can tell everybody what the next book is gonna feature a similar character or the same character.
The same character. So Mike Brink is coming back. He's coming back and he's in Japan, and he has been brought to Japan to open a 19th century puzzle box that has a mysterious treasure inside. And so I went to Japan in March to do the research and went to a place called Hakone up in the mountains in Japan, where they make actual puzzle boxes. I don't know if you guys know what they look like, but they're these kind of beautiful small wooden boxes, and they're mechanical puzzles. So you push one part, and then when you push that part, another part will open. And the trick of it is figuring out the order in which you open the box. Some of them can be very, very tricky. So yeah, Mike Brink is coming back, and I'm really excited to have him going to another country and to have another big puzzle to solve. But I need to get through this book tour first so I could think about it and concentrate and actually write it.
Makes sense. And that's true. I have heard people say when they've done like their UK tour, take a break and then come to the US, that sometimes it is a little disruptive.
I think so.
Yeah, good. Well, everybody, thank you for hopping on. I'm going to get started now. We were just kind of chatting until we got most everybody on. If you have a question, you're welcome to just raise your hand and ask it, but also you could put your name in the chat. That will help me a little bit in terms of just, you don't have to put the question, but just if you want to ask a question, throw your name in there. It might help me just figure it out. But I don't know if anybody wants to start or if you want me to start. Does anybody have a question they want to ask? Okay, Michelle.
Just with that information you just gave us, I'd love to know if you knew there was book 2 coming featuring Mike Brink as you were writing book 1, because there seemed to talk about a puzzle piece of getting the whole plot together to wrap up the way it did, which I thought was really great. But now to think in your head, did you know Mike was coming back?
So I didn't know when I was writing that book until so I wrote through the first draft of that, and I didn't know that this was going to be a series, but I really fell in love with that character. And so as I was revising, I was thinking this could be a series, because I feel like Mike Brink is complicated enough and his situation is rich enough that he could come back in multiple different situations with different characters and different puzzles and be interesting every time. So yeah, I didn't know. I'm gonna just hold on, put my focus on here so that nobody texts me. Do not disturb. I realized he was interesting enough to me as the writer to keep writing about him. And so I thought that if I'm interested, maybe my readers will be interested too. So to answer your question, the first draft, no, I had no idea. But then when I was revising, when I finished the book, I realized that I would like to write more books about him.
Great. Well, I'm excited already for it.
Right. I'm excited that you're excited.
And I guess what I should have said, Karen, I'm going to call on you in 2 seconds. What I should have said first is welcome, Danielle, because we were already talking, but I should have done, so I need to back up. Welcome, Danielle. We're thrilled you're here. I will do that now, leaping in. Danielle actually she and I hatched this idea. Well, I interviewed Danielle twice, because the first time there was an internet connection problem. We're not sure where, but there was, and it kept dropping. And so we rescheduled and we interviewed again, which was really fun because I learned a lot, but time consuming for Danielle. But while we were talking about various things, I was telling her about the early reads program, and she said, oh, I would have loved to have done that if I'd known about it. How about we try this? And so she pitched it to her publisher. So we have her to thank for this idea. And I just love it. So thank you, Danielle, for both the idea and the time you're taking to meet with us in the middle of your book just coming out.
Well, it's my pleasure. I actually love what you're doing and that you're all reading books early. I think that that's a fantastic idea. I wish that I could do that. And now that I'm not reviewing, I had a column in the New York Times Book Review where I was reviewing books, and it took up a lot of my time. But now that I'm not doing that, I'm going to try to do what you guys are doing and read great books before they come out.
It's really fun. And part of what's fun too is that we're usually the first person to meet with the author that's actually read the book, you know, the first time that the author gets to talk about the book. And so that's been really fun, something I didn't really think about when we were coming up with it. But I do appreciate your having this idea and pitching it to your publisher and everything. So thank you.
It was great to have the hard copy.
Yes, it
Just
is.
have it.
Yeah, exactly. Nice to have.
So Random House sent you hard copies?
They
That's
did
wonderful.
35. Yes. So they
Mhm.
said they would do 35 hard copies, and that
Amazing.
mine's not included in the 35. They sent me one
Yes.
too. And then everybody else after that got NetGalley. And I think there were maybe 8 more after that. So yeah,
Wonderful. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so pleased.
I was thrilled.
If you want a signed book plate, let me know and I can send you one for your book.
Yes.
I have some signed book plates. Just, I don't know, Cindy, if
I
you
was going to
can
say, why don't anybody who wants a signed book plate, just email me. I have your addresses, or at least most of your addresses from things, and I'll just compile it all and send it to Danielle. How's that?
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect. So, okay, Karen, sorry, I did not mean to interrupt your question, but I just realized I hadn't really kicked us off like I should have. So now, Karen, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's great. I really enjoyed the character of Connie and was wondering why you decided to include a dog, and also will she be in the next book?
So there's a couple of reasons. One, Mike Brink seemed really in his head in an earlier draft of the book. And I wanted to find a way for him to be able to express emotional connection without it being with a person per se, right? Because the whole the situation with Mike Brink is that his savant syndrome and having sort of this ability makes it difficult for him to connect with people, so that when he meets Jess Price, it's kind of this overwhelming connection that he feels. But I didn't want him to feel totally closed off to the reader. And what's the best way to see an emotional connection than seeing someone with their pet? So I decided to give him a dog. I had a dachshund when I was growing up. And so I used, my dachshund, that my dog's name was not Conundrum, but I liked that name. And so I decided to give him a pet.
Okay.
And I think it also gives him, a companion that, helps him sort of, well, I'm really interested with Mike Brink. I'll just, sort of take an aside. What I'm really interested in Mike Brink is the balance between the intellect and the emotion and the emotional world. And I think that that's a problem that a lot of people, especially me as a writer, struggles with, right? I'm often in my head and then like moving from writing into different realms with my own children or with my husband. It's hard to move between those realms. So I was interested in exploring that with Mike Brink. And I love the idea of there being just a lightness to that movement and a lightness to a sort of emotional expression. And his dog seemed like the best option. And Conundrum is going to be in every book.
Great.
I can't hurt Conundrum. I think if I ever put the dog, everyone reading would just like leave. They would be like, no.
I'm out.
Thank you.
All right, Kelly, you have a question?
I do. Hi, Danielle. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I just thought your book was so unique in the best way. There's no other books that I can really even compare it to because of the way that you incorporated the puzzles into the book. And I know you mentioned in the author's note a little bit about how you wove those in and how you worked with somebody to develop those. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how you really incorporated such a unique aspect into the book.
Sure. So when I realized that Mike Brink was a genius puzzle solver, my first thought was, oh no, how am I going to pull this off? Because I am not a genius puzzle solver by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not even really good at math. Like I'm pretty bad at math, and I'm not great at puzzles, although I love Wordle, and I do crosswords and that sort of thing, but that's where it stops. And so I had a friend who knows Will Shortz, the editor of the New York Times Games page, and I just took a chance and cold called him, sent him an email, and said, "Listen, this is the novel I'm writing. Would you mind talking to me?" And he very generously invited me to his home, and took me through his puzzle library. He has this enormous puzzle library. He's been collecting puzzles all of his life. And I saw these sort of antique puzzles, one of the first crossword puzzle books ever published. It was just completely fascinating. And so we talked a lot about him. And what was important about that interview, other than seeing his puzzle library, was understanding the thought processes that he, as someone who makes puzzles and who has spent his life in that world, goes through. It's very different than what I originally thought. I thought that puzzle constructors just sort of wave a magic wand and there's the puzzle, right? No struggle, like they can just put it together. And the way I think that people who think, that look at novels and think, oh yeah, that person just sat down, the writer just sits down and out it comes, it's not they don't understand the process. But when he walked me through it, I saw like really how layered that process is, and how there is a struggle. And it's a lot like what writers do when they're writing, right? They can make a certain piece of their novel and then try another piece and then make it fit together. And it's really, it really felt I really understood it after talking to him. So that helped me solidify Mike Brink. Oh my gosh. And then I got to the point when I realized that I couldn't actually make the puzzles that were going to be in the book myself, because some of them are quite complicated. Some of those puzzles I did do myself. For example, that cipher with Jess Price's blood, her splotching her blood on the page. That was one that I made. A few other ones. I'm sorry, I put can you hear that coming in? I put do not.
I can't hear it.
Okay, great. Some texts are coming in and I put a do not disturb on, but they're still coming.
Okay.
But so I realized I needed help with the actual puzzles that are in the book. So Will Shortz recommended two of his favorite puzzle constructors for the New York Times to work with me. One of them was a number puzzles guy, and he did the number puzzles. There's one, I think, kind of in the first third of the book that ends up spelling Mike Brink, when you add certain numbers together. And then the other one is the triangulum that is sort of introduced in the beginning, and then it's solved in the end. And the other guy was a word puzzle person, and he helped me with the other puzzles that were word puzzles. And so that process was really interesting because, as you know from reading it, you can read the book without actually doing the puzzles. But if you like puzzles, you can pause, pull out a pencil and start writing on your book, or making notes in a notebook. And I loved the idea of that sort of two-layered process of reading, and having a kind of interactive element for the person who was reading the book, where they could put themselves in the shoes of the character solving the puzzle. I felt like in some ways that it augmented or like magnified the reading process that we all have anyway. Because for me, I realized as I was writing this book that my process of writing a novel, and sometimes, when people are reading a novel, is a little bit like putting together a puzzle. You have complicated pieces that don't seem to fit together, and as you go, everything starts to make sense, and it all, hopefully by the end, you have a solution. So working with those puzzle constructors was just amazing, and really helped me make this book I think, sort of go over above and beyond what I originally intended it to be or thought it could be. So I really owe a lot to those guys.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I just can't wait to see what you do next.
Me too. I can't wait.
And I know people were hopping on as Danielle was talking, and her next book is about Mike Brink as well. So I just want to make sure everybody had heard that he'll be in Japan solving a puzzle box. So in case anybody missed that. Renata, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi. I had the same question as Kelly, actually. So thank you for answering it, but I can spin it a different way. With savant syndrome and your research into that, I know you had cited that it was extremely rare, like 55 some odd cases that are known. So what was your research into that? Or did you speak with people that had had interactions with someone diagnosed?
That's such a great question. It is so rare that I actually have not spoken to someone who has savant syndrome. As I put in the note, there's about 50 people. I think it's more like between 50 and 75 people that have been documented that are alive now that have this. But what I did is there's a doctor named Dr. Trevert who had a clinic in Wisconsin, actually. He recently passed away after I wrote the book, but he was the first doctor that worked with savants. He worked with the man that Rain Man is based on. And he's worked with a whole spectrum of people who are savants, from people who have autism, who are savants, to people who have acquired savant syndrome, which means that they were normal, just like you and me, not particularly gifted at something, and then had a traumatic brain injury that changed the chemistry and the structure of their brain function. So I did a lot of reading of his work. I read, essays he's written. He has a couple of books he wrote. And I also, through reading those books, I found a couple of memoirs that his patients wrote. And those were really helpful. There was especially one that was very helpful. A young man in his 20s was beaten very badly. And he woke up in the hospital and he had extreme synesthesia and found that he could draw these completely elaborate kind of fractal paintings and drawings, very mathematical patterns. And that was especially informative about Mike Brink, because it's a little bit of the way that he sees the world. He'll walk into a room and he'll see a pattern that none of us would see, and it's accompanied by a synesthesia element. So I hope that answers your question, but it was a lot of research around the clinical side of it. But the danger of that for me was I fall in love with the research and I want to put all of it in. And I had pages and pages of sort of clinical research in the original draft that I ended up pulling out. But it's nice to hear, I think, it seems like there's enough in there that you get what he's going through and the clinical side without it being too heavy.
For sure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Karen McNamara.
Sure. Hi, Danielle. Thanks for joining us and thanks for sharing your book. I thought the puzzle portion was fascinating, but there were also so many other pieces to it. The porcelain, the golem, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the Lilith reference. And so I'm kind of curious how it evolved. Like what were you starting with to sort of incorporate all these interesting items into the book?
That's such an interesting question, and it really gets to the heart of my process with this book. And I will say also, I don't think I will replicate that in future books, because the process of writing this book was a process of discovery. I didn't start knowing that I was going to have Mike Brink. I started knowing I wanted to write about the main puzzle. So the porcelain doll, the golem, the 19th century Prague section, those were originally their own novel. I was thinking that those were going to be that was going to be it. But when I wrote those sections, I felt that there was something missing, because I realized no one was solving the puzzle, right? Like it was just laid out and it felt very static. So I kind of reverse engineered it. And originally I had a journalist. Mike Brink was a journalist coming to the prison and, sort of moving through the book in that way, in a sort of path of discovery. And that seemed boring to me. I'm probably giving you too much information here, but that seemed a little bit boring to me. And then I realized, well, I started thinking about it, like, what kind of person would solve such a complicated ancient puzzle? Well, someone who's amazing at puzzles. And then I got onto the Mike Brink track and started doing all the research about savant syndrome and talking to Will Shortz, et cetera. So really, it's like the center was the beginning, originally in my first drafts, and then it sort of radiated out. And then, I mean, just from a writer's point of view, if any of you write, like, I ended up rewriting it all so that it was seamlessly put together. My biggest fear was that it would feel like different novels, right? But I think that the puzzle itself holds it together, and Mike being a puzzle constructor holds it together. So yeah, that was the process. And I think of this because it's turned into a series, and there's going to be another book and maybe even a third. If people like this series enough, there might be a third. I think of it as a little bit like when you're watching a television show and you have the pilot episode that's got all of the sort of philosophical and intellect, elements that set up the entire series. And then with episode 2, it just kind of spins out, right? You get those things sort of happening throughout the series. So I anticipate the next book won't have a historical element like that, but it will carry through those concepts. I'm very interested in, the technology strand. I'm very interested in the idea of longevity and life after the body, disintegrate. All of these sort of philosophical elements that are in the book are going to carry through the series.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I thought you did a great job of pulling them all together into that one sort of amazing puzzle. So
thank you. I'm happy to hear that.
And that ending, that's what I was, when we talked for the podcast, I was like, oh my gosh.
Well, the ending is what I really cared about. Like, I loved that research that allowed that ending. And so making the rest of the novel support that was really the goal.
Does anybody else want to ask something? Okay, I'll keep asking. I actually have my list of questions. So you really keep the pace up, and that's something that several people have mentioned to me, that like you get to the end of the chapter and you want to keep going. So did you have to really work on that, or was that something that just came naturally as you were writing?
It kind of comes naturally. I mean, of course, I go back and I refine it. But I think I made a decision when I was writing this book that I wanted it to move fast. I wanted it to carry the reader along. I wanted it to be, I still wanted the writing to be good. You know what I mean? I didn't want it to be one of those books that you just like page through and you're not paying attention to the actual language, because I love writing and I love language. But I made a decision early on that I was going to keep the chapters at about 5 pages. And by setting that limitation on myself, it helped create an arc in each chapter, and it gave me something to move into with the next chapter. I wasn't tempted to write a 10-page chapter or a 15-page chapter that felt maybe too long or kind of lagged. There was always something I was moving into. So I think that maybe that is why it feels propulsive in that way. My other books, I have never done that before. My chapters tended to be longer, and they ended in on more of an emotional note, I think, rather than a plot note. So I guess that's why this book is a thriller rather than, more literary fiction, because it does have those kind of endings at the end of chapters.
Well, and I do think short chapters, everybody thinks, oh, I can read one more, and it's that thing that kind of keeps you going along, versus a longer chapter. You're like, should I start this one, or am I done for now? And I think when they're short, you just keep thinking, I'll just do one more.
Right. It's like potato chips or something.
Exactly. Amy, you have a question?
Sure. Thanks, Danielle. I really enjoyed the book. I was really surprised and really liked the character of Rachel. And I was just wondering what your inspiration was in including her, and kind of how you saw her fitting into the story, because I thought she had a really interesting relationship with Mike and others.
I am so glad to hear that because I love Rachel. And when I was doing research into the Jewish mysticism that's in the book, in the Kabbalah, I came across the writings of a female rabbi. And there's just so few of them that you hear, you don't really hear about that. And so I wanted to include a female character like that. She's not necessarily the rabbi that I read about, but she's someone who's very knowledgeable. Also, I wanted her to have a connection with Mike Brink that felt real, and her losing her husband and having, a tragedy that happened in her life helps her connect to Mike. And because Jess Price is kind of, he's a little bit obsessed with her, but she's kind of abstract for him. I think that relationship with her is more real, and they form a real friendship. I would like for her to come back because I do think that she's a genuine friend for Mike. And also, her mystical view of reality is so interesting to me. When he has that kind of out there experience at the end and she's there and she tells the story of the angel that closes the lip, and that when you're a baby in the womb and you forget everything and you start over and have to relearn all of human knowledge. I love that point of view of consciousness and the brain and how we live in the world. So yeah, I really like her too. And I also, just from a very technical position as a writer, I needed someone to deliver all that information about the Kabbalah. And I know that gets pretty heavy, right? Just like in the porcelain, it does get pretty heavy sometimes. There's a lot of information that people give. But it was essential, especially the Kabbalah information, to understand how the puzzle fit together. And she was the perfect person to deliver it, I thought.
Yeah, great. No, I thought she was a great character. Thank you.
So let's talk about the dolls.
Ooh.
And the creepy dolls. I know we talked before. I said I'm never going to look at dolls the same way again after Grady Hendrix's book and your book this year. I am swearing off puppets and dolls. So how did you bring that into the story and why?
So that was one of the early elements with the Jess Price story. And I realized kind of after I wrote a couple drafts of that it was based on, my great grandmother had a porcelain doll that looks a lot like the doll that's in the book. And I have Cindy, I think I told you I was going to send you a picture and I never did, but I have a picture of this doll. I had my mom has it right now. She's leaving it to me. She said she's going to give it to me one day, so I'll have it. But it's something that I saw as a kid. And I think that it stayed with me and really creeped me out, because it's always sort of been at the back of my mind that I would like to put porcelain doll in a story in some way. And it just ended up here. It seemed like a good vehicle. And the theme of, soul leaving the body and transubstantiation, all of that stuff seemed really to work well with a haunted doll. So yeah, it's one of those parts I had a few emails from people, or messages on social media saying, those dolls, I was up all night, I can't sleep. I'm really freaked out by your doll.
Yeah, if anybody has a doll in their house, they're probably moving it to some closet they could lock it up or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I was like, oh gosh, the dolls. Yeah, so I'm telling you, that's pretty funny. Well, does anybody have a question? Leslie just said the dolls were creepy. Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't miss any. Does anybody have a question? I don't want to leap in front of everybody. Okay. What changes did you make? I mean, we've talked a little bit about it. You pulled out some of the information to avoid info dumps, but was there stuff that you had in there that was going in a different direction that you altered once you got going?
Yeah, so once I knew that Mike Brink was the central driving force, a lot of the Jess Price story left. It had to serve the overall arc of Mike Brink's story. He became the protagonist. The antagonist, Jameson Sedge, really became a villain, that was against Mike rather than Jess, or just sort of this, random person. I put those two in relationship to each other. So the 19th century Prague chapters were originally much, much longer. I think they were maybe even 3 times as long as what's in the book. And I loved them so much that it was really hard for me to cut them out. I think we got to the second pass pages. You know, for those of you who don't know what that is, when you're in the publishing process, you get a set of first pass pages that you can correct. It's almost like they're giving you a warning, right? Like, okay, you have this one chance, and then there's second pass. And it's like, this is your final chance to make any changes. You better do it now. And I got those pages, and that's the point that I cut out a lot of the 19th century material, because it didn't feel like it belonged in the novel anymore. It felt like it belonged in the original idea of what that book was. That was really painful. And I think you probably hear writers say, kill your darlings and all of that. That was a moment where I had to make a decision. Do I keep this material in that I really like? I think that's really well written, and I put a lot of work into researching it, or do I sacrifice it for the larger reading experience so that it all feels the same? And I took it out, and last night at my event at the book launch, I told that story, and someone suggested that I post the whole thing on my website. And I think I might do that, just if people want extra, reading. They can see what that was like. But I think it was the right decision to take it out of the book.
So when you do that with the first pass or the second pass, where does your editor figure in that?
So my editor's done at that stage.
So it doesn't matter to the editor whether you pull the stuff out or not. I guess that's kind of my question, maybe is a way to phrase it.
I think if I did something extreme, my editor would care. And I did run that by her. And she said, her response was, well, I love that material. If you want to keep it in, I think you should. Right. And so it really was my decision. And, but my editor is it's interesting. I'm the only book like my book that she's edited. She's an executive editor at Random House, and a lot of her books are more leaning toward literary, not so much of a thriller. And so, of course, she loved those elements, and she was like, you're the author, you decide. And so I did. But when you get to second pass pages, you've been through the copy editing process, you've been through everything with your editor, and that's really, you're supposed to be like checking on punctuation and like spelling, right? Like it's really the very end. I shouldn't be pulling 60 pages of material at that point, but that's how long it took me to get there. It was hard. It was hard to cut that material.
That's why I was just curious if your editor would weigh in, because I knew that kind of was the final stage. And it doesn't sound like that substantially altered your book. But I would think if somebody was doing something that did substantially alter their book, they might need a whole nother pass around. You know what I mean?
I think that happens. They really don't like that to happen because it's expensive for them to make changes at that point. And there's even in some contracts, I mean, to get into like the really particular stuff, if you make significant changes that cost them money, they deduct it from your royalties at that point, because they have to redo all of this, I don't know, whatever they do to print it. But no, it was fine because it was just cutting. It wasn't changing things around or moving chapters or anything like that.
Got it. I remember when I interviewed for the behind the scenes series, a person who's an interior book designer, and they talk about how the pages are in groups of 8. And so, if you have 2 extra pages, 4 extra pages, they have to find ways to fill the front, fill the back, putting in quotes, things like that. So I'm sure that's where that comes in too, is they've got everything laid out exactly like it should be. And now they're pulling some of it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And they don't like us to do it. They put a lot of effort in.
Yeah, and somebody commented, I think Kalina commented in here that she would love to read that stuff online. So it sounds like that's a great idea. And then Kelly asks, were the ARCs different than the finished copy? Were these changes before the ARCs came out?
They were before the ARCs are exactly like the finished copy. I didn't change anything. So I got very lucky. I think some writers have their advanced copies, they're printed before they're done. With all of the editing. And I think that's a real shame. I mean, as someone who was a reviewer, often what I read to review is the ARC. And so if they make significant changes, that I don't see it. So knowing that, right, from the point of view of someone who is a reviewer, and knowing that my reviewers would get my arc, I was really careful to make sure it was as perfect as possible.
Well, and that's so interesting that you say that about the arcs, because I know that people have told me before, the publisher has said, well, you sometimes in this instance, you really want the NetGalley version because they can continue to update it on NetGalley. So like
Yeah.
what you would download originally might be different than what you download 3 months into it being on NetGalley. And I didn't realize that they printed galleys or arcs before the author was totally finished sometimes, which I thought was fascinating because you really are reading sometimes a different book. I mean, I've had an author say, oh yeah, that part came out. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know that. So it's kind of confusing.
It's confusing, and I think that it's from a different period in publishing, back when it took a long time to create advanced copies. Now with I don't know why. I think that they should change the system so that they have the last version for everybody. Maybe that just delays things a little bit, but it's probably better.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. Tell me about the title and the cover. I know we've already talked about this, but I want everybody to hear it, particularly the cover, because it's such an interesting story.
So are you referring to the multiple versions that we did?
Yes.
So we went through probably 15 or 20 different covers. And my editor and the team at Random House they wanted to get just the perfect cover. And they settled on one cover that was purple and sort of had puzzle blocks. And everybody loved it. I didn't love it that much, but I felt like I had been such a pain because, we'd gone through so many covers and I was like, no, that one's not it. No, I'm not feeling it. And we get to this one and I'm like, well, that's okay. That's better than the other ones. But the whole team was like, yes, we're going to do it. That's the one. And I wish I had it here. Maybe I could find it on my phone. So it was going all the way. It was being approved. And then it went to the sales department, it's this big team of the people that go out to the reps to bookstores, and they hated it. They were like, this is not a thriller cover. This doesn't look like the book. And they changed it. And they went, and at the last minute, I think the cover design people were having a kind of nervous breakdown. And they were probably like, we have to find the one. And they just did it in a weekend. They came up with this cover and I love it so much. I think it's really good. I'm just scrolling through my phone here because I want to try to find the cover that they had approved before, because you'll see how different it is.
But tell me that the waves are like quantum waves or something that
yeah, and the waves. So I call them quantum waves because, there's this quantum physics element in the book. And I love them. And then they put gold foil. You guys have the finished copy. So you have the foil. The arcs, the advanced copies don't have the foil. So I didn't know they were going to do that. And they surprised me. I was so happy to see it. All right. I'm sorry I'm doing this, but I want to find.
Okay, no, I'd love to see it.
Want to see some different versions of different covers?
Yeah, that would be great.
So here's one that they were thinking of.
So what's in the background?
It's like a maze.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Oh, okay.
And if you see it, so
Yeah.
that was, where's another one? Here's another one.
Oh, and that's interesting font.
Yeah, it's an interesting font, but it doesn't pop in the same way, right?
No.
It doesn't, it looks cool. It looks kind of techno, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't have, and the one that they ultimately decided on is this one. Okay, here is this one. This is the one they were going to print.
Oh, okay. Oh, that is interesting.
It's kind of this, puzzle blocky.
Yeah. But I think maybe they're going with the AI aspects like that. Those all kind of remind me of thinking, like you said, more techie, the AI portion of your story.
Exactly. They didn't quite capture. I mean, and so this one, it just feels like those waves, right?
Yeah. And the colors are better.
And I think the colors are better. I don't know. I think it just worked. And the salespeople, anyway, just went crazy. They were like, yes, you got it.
Well, orange and red seem to be all the rage. I mean, everybody keeps talking about how that a lot of the covers now are either orange or red, and that's sort of the colors du jour.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Valerie has a question.
Thanks for being here and congratulations on the release of your book.
Thank
I'm always
you.
curious about character names. How did you name your characters?
So interesting because I changed them a few times. But Mike Brink was always Mike Brink. I liked the name Brink because it made me feel like he was on the edge of something. And then Mike sounds good with Brink, I think, like the K. So it was really about, you know, the meaning of the last name, but then the first name sounded good, I thought, with the last name. Jameson Sedge was originally named Jameson Bracken. And I changed it because an early reader was like, there's so many B's. You have Brink and Bracken, and you know, I think there was another character with a B. For some reason, I had B on the brain when I was writing this, and a lot of the character names had B. So I went back and I changed Bracken to Sedge. But as you know, there's a puzzle solution with Sedge being the answer, and Bracken means the same thing as Sedge. So I had to find a replacement name that not only didn't start with B, but that also meant the same thing. So I had sort of like cornered myself, and that was an interesting moment. So and what other Vivek Gupta is a character I really love. That's Mike Brink's mentor from MIT. And his name was inspired by someone who is a really great guy, who is a friend of my husband's, who's Indian. And his name is Vivek, and Gupta is just another name that I chose. That's totally random. Can't
What
think of
about
any.
Jess?
And conundrum, of course, conundrum, right? Like that. And I loved shortening that to Connie.
How about Jess?
So Jess, I wanted her to have a kind of non-distinct name. I don't know if that makes sense, but Jess Price seemed it didn't seem to stand out in any way. I wanted it to feel kind of like a normal person's name. And I wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be multi-syllabic. I wanted it to be sort of short, and kind of inoffensive. I don't know if that makes sense, but I didn't want people to get caught on the name. I wanted them to think about her. And so I chose just a sort of plain name for her.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
So
I had
Mary,
never
oh, sorry.
before, by the way. Thank you, Valerie, for asking that, because it's the first time I've thought about it in a long time.
I always think that question is so interesting too, how people decide on character names. So I'm glad you asked that, Valerie. Mary says the orange in the final cover is really striking, stands out from the crowd. And then Rebecca asks, in the book, a couple of times a Joan Didion quote is written by the characters. What is the story behind that quote?
Well, so Jess Price is a young writer. And if you remember, she goes to Sedge House because she's house sitting, and it affords her time to write and to work on her new book. And when I was a young writer, I loved Joan Didion. I still love Joan Didion. And I especially like that passage that is from an essay on keeping a notebook. And it's something that I do keep a notebook. And I thought that it also afforded that character a sort of kind of texture to what she's doing, right? Because she's there and she's not really working consistently, right? She's kind of writing things down, and she's sort of playing with writing and trying to get into her work. And it seemed like an authentic thing for that character to do would be to write down something from Joan Didion.
That was a good question. One of my questions for you is, I know you have written 2 memoirs. So do you want to talk a little bit about writing the memoirs, and then how different it was writing the memoirs versus writing this book? And you've written other fiction as well, but the difference in fiction versus memoir.
Sure. So my first book was a memoir. My first published book was a book about my father, and it was a memoir. And it was a project that took about 10 years for me to write. It was published when I was 32. So it took most of my 20s of trying to figure out how to write that book. And in some ways, the way that I explain it to myself now is that I taught myself how to write because I needed to express the relationship between me and my dad in some form. My dad was a veteran from the Vietnam War. He was a tunnel rat. I don't know if people know what that is. There were tunnels that soldiers went into, and I was born after he came home, but the man that I grew up knowing was very different from what I had heard from the man who went to war. He had severe PTSD, problems with alcohol and drugs. And I grew up with sort of a shadow father, someone who was really struggling and suffering. And so I needed to write that book. I wrote a draft of it when I was in graduate school as a novel. And that novel, I always wanted to be a novelist. I wasn't ever imagining that I would be a memoir, writing a memoir. But that novel, I sent it out, I got an agent. It won some small award before obviously it was never published, but it won a small award when I submitted it to a contest. It got an agent. It went out to 25 different editors and they all rejected it. And the reasoning behind the rejection, from what I gathered, was it didn't feel real enough. And ironically, a lot of it was real, right? A lot of it was about my life, but my life, it turns out, was so wild, right? Like in my father's situation, and the situation was that when my parents divorced when I was 12, I went and lived with my dad, and he did all of these crazy things. It's a little bit like the Glass Castle in some ways. And as a novel, it didn't work because it felt unbelievable. But when you shifted genre and you call it a memoir, and I took, the pieces that were real out, and I made a book proposal of 50 pages with those sections, and my agent sent it back out, and it sold at auction with 6 bidders, like in 2 weeks.
Wow. And I've got it here, right? This is
right. That's the one.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
That's the one. And so, it was really a lesson to me that how we categorize our work and what we call it has weight, and it matters to people. And so then I went away and rewrote. I'd used some of those sections, but rewrote the whole thing, wrote this memoir, and it was published. But then I was, a memoirist, like when that was out, and it did very well. But I'm like, wait, I want to be a fiction writer now. And so I also knew that I couldn't write the same kind of book again. That would be impossible because it had been such a process to write that, and that was a unique story. And so I went the opposite direction, and I wrote something called Angelology, which is very imaginative. It has the kind of gritty, it has a lot of realism. It feels like a realist novel when you're wading into it, but slowly over the course of 100 pages or so, some kind of speculative and strange things start to happen. And that was really liberating for me because it was the first book that was not tied to my family, not tied to my relationship with my dad. And it was really me defining myself as a novelist. And so the difference, I guess, to answer your question, Cindy, a long roundabout way to answer your question,
is interesting.
The difference between writing fiction and writing memoir is, obviously, first, I've written 2 memoirs. They're both completely true, right? They're based on elements of my life, people in my life. I don't change the names of characters. They're all people that I know. There's a risk factor emotionally in writing those books. I can make people angry. I can make people sad. And so I'm really careful about what I write. And it's something that I don't take lightly. And then fiction is much more freeing, right? I can have this process like I did, for example, with the Puzzle Master, where I'm just playing around with ideas. I know that I want to have these things happen and can make these characters up, and I can play with names. And it's really wonderful creatively to have that freedom. I'm not someone who writes about my life in fiction. I save that for memoir, clearly. And so fiction for me is pure play and pure fun.
Well, yes, and I think that's so interesting that you said that about when you tried to write it as fiction, that everybody said this is so unbelievable, because I read a lot of historical fiction and it'll be so fascinating to me. You get to the author's note and the author will include these things, like these things really happened that I included, and it's the things you would never dream would have really happened. And then, we talk about it if I'm interviewing them, and they're like, yes, my publisher, my, publicist, my editor made me put this in here because nobody would actually believe that these things could happen. And I think sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, but people aren't going to believe it because they're like, nope, that's too unrealistic.
Totally. And
Yeah.
you have to create all this architecture in a novel to make those crazy things feel believable. Whereas in reality, sometimes things just come out of left field and they're crazy. And if you say that this is nonfiction, then people say, oh, wow, that's a really crazy thing that happened to you. And you're like, yes.
And if
it
it's
is.
fiction, they're like, no way that could really happen. But you're like,
They're like, no way, I don't believe it. It's just not aesthetically set up properly, right? Because it takes a lot of, I think of it as architecture. You have to have the flying buttresses holding up, the rooftop with fiction. And if you don't have that, it does feel unbelievable. So I get it. I understand why that book was rejected.
It's just always kind of funny, I think. Well, what are you reading lately that you really liked?
Oh, good question. I've been so busy. I haven't been reading that much. Oh, something that's coming up. Maybe you guys would like this. It's coming up in August. It's a historical mystery called Broadway Butterfly. Have you heard of this?
I just read it.
Do you like it?
I thought it was phenomenal. It was so good. Yeah.
Great. I've been reading that too. And I have my great grandmother, the same one with the porcelain doll, was for a very brief time a Ziegfeld Follies dancer. And I don't have it here because I'm not at home. I'm in a hotel room, but I have her portrait from 1922 with, she's wearing this sort of fur collar and her hair in this like very 20s bob. And I showed it. So I know the author who wrote that, and I showed it to her and she was like, that's the year that my book is set in. And so, I really wanted to read her book, and she generously sent me an advance copy, and I've been reading it and loving it.
So for everybody that doesn't know about it, it is about a murder. It's fiction, but it's very closely follows a real unsolved crime from the 1920s. This woman who lived, I think, on 57th Street in New York, and was murdered. And there's all these different people coming and going, and they still don't know who did it, but she kind of pieces it all together. It's fascinating. I just read like yours. It just read super quick. And she has this really great thing at the end where she goes through each character and what they did in real life and kind of what the rest of their life looked like. It was very well done.
I feel like you should have her on because she actually has photographs of these characters, and it's fascinating to see the photographs of them too.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, I plan to. And in fact, I've just launched this second Patreon tier, and she's going to do the spoilers with me too, so we can talk more about, being unsolved and kind of some of the things she found. And then somebody just asked for the title. It's Broadway Butterfly, and it's Sarah. Is it Sarah DeVello? Is that her name?
Sarah DeVello, yes.
Okay. And she has, is she the one that has that murder podcast, like the Murder Raven or something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Something with Murder by the Book in Houston.
Yeah, they pair with her sometimes and use her to do like some of their interviewing, but she's got an online presence, and I can't think of what it's called, but it's something to do with
Murder Maven, like Murder Maven.
Murder Maven, that's what it is.
Like that.
Yeah, so I'm curious to ask her about that too when I interview her.
Yeah. Oh, great. You're going to enjoy it, I think.
Yeah, no, I thought the book was great. So good. Well, does anybody have any questions before we hop off? This has been great. And I already have a couple messages from people who want signed book plates, but feel free to just shoot me an email. I'll consolidate it all and I'll send it to you, Danielle. And when you get back home, because I know it may be a while, send me a picture of the doll and I can send it out.
Okay, I have it on my phone, so I'm gonna send it to you.
Even better. Okay, good. And then I can send it so everybody can see it. So, well, thanks everybody for joining us. And thanks, Danielle, for the books and this event and everything. And good luck as you make your way out, and have fun with the New York Book Club thing too that you won. That's awesome.
Thank you so much. It was really great to be here. Stay in touch, everyone. Find me on social media.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.